Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The moment it happened, no one at Forrester Creations realized they were about to witness a day that would be whispered about for decades. The kind of day that permanently rewrites a family's history, because it began so quietly, so deceptively normal, with Brooke Logan standing by the windows of the executive office, sunlight washing over her face as she stared out at the city she'd called home for most of her life, unaware that within hours her world, Ridge's world, and the entire Forrester legacy would be hanging by a thread, and Ridge Forrester, ever the protector, ever the man who believed he could fix anything if he just tried hard enough, was already on edge, pacing behind her, his instincts screaming that something wasn't right even before the alarm sounded, before the chaos erupted, before fate made its brutal move. It started with the smell, sharp, acrid, unmistakable, smoke seeping into the hallway, triggering confused murmurs among employees who looked up from their desks, and then the fire alarm blared, shrill and merciless, echoing through the building as panic spread like wildfire, people rushing toward exits while security shouted orders that barely cut through the noise, and in the middle of it all Brooke froze, her breath catching in her throat as she realized the smoke was thickening far too fast, her chest tightening with every inhale. While Ridge saw it instantly, saw the fear in her eyes, saw her sway as dizziness took hold, and without hesitation he moved, grabbing her arm, pulling her close, his voice low but urgent as he told her to stay with him, to keep breathing, to trust him the way she always had. The stairwell they rushed toward was already clogged with people, smoke curling down from above, and somewhere behind them there was an explosion, small, contained, but enough to send a violent tremor through the building, knocking Brooke off balance, her head striking the wall as she cried out, collapsing into Ridge's arms, limp and unresponsive, and that was the moment Ridge's world narrowed to a single point, everything else fading away as he dropped to his knees with her, cradling her head, calling her name over and over, refusing to accept the terrifying stillness, the way her chest barely moved, the way her lips had begun to pale. Someone screamed for help. Someone shouted that the fire department was on the way. But Ridge didn't hear any of it. All he heard was the sound of Brooke's shallow breaths turning weaker by the second, and he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Ignoring the security guards yelling that the stairwell was unsafe, Ridge hoisted Brooke into his arms and turned back the way they'd come, toward a service corridor he remembered from years ago, a route that might still be clear, smoke burning his lungs as he pushed forward, each step heavier than the last, his heart pounding not just from exertion but from the sheer terror of losing her. By the time he reached the loading bay, flames were licking along the ceiling, heat pressing down like a physical force, and Brooke went completely still in his arms. "No, no, no," Ridge whispered, his voice breaking as he lowered her to the ground, checking her pulse, his fingers trembling when he found it weak but present, his relief short-lived as he realized she wasn't breathing. That was when panic truly set in. Ridge tore off his jacket, rolled Brooke onto her back and began CPR, counting compressions through clenched teeth, his arms burning as he forced air into her lungs, smoke stinging his eyes, every second stretching into an eternity, and when someone nearby screamed, "Help, he's not breathing!" It wasn't just about Brooke anymore, because as Ridge pushed himself beyond his limits, something inside his own body began to fail. He felt it first as a crushing pressure in his chest, sharp and sudden, radiating down his arm, stealing his breath, but he ignored it, refused to stop because Brooke coughed then just once, a weak sound that felt like a miracle, and Ridge laughed through tears, urging her to breathe, telling her she was safe, that he had her, that everything was going to be okay, even as his own vision blurred, the edges darkening. Firefighters burst through the bay moments later, hauling Brooke onto a stretcher, oxygen mask secured over her face, one of them shouting questions Ridge barely processed, because now it was his turn to stagger, his knees buckling as the pain became unbearable. And when he finally collapsed to the concrete floor, gasping, clutching his chest, the words rang out again, this time filled with pure terror. "Help! He's not breathing!" Paramedics swarmed him, cutting open his shirt, attaching monitors, their expressions grim as alarms began to beep erratically, and somewhere through the haze Ridge heard Brooke's voice calling his name, weak but desperate, her hand reaching for him as they wheeled her past, tears streaming down her face as she realized what was happening, as she understood that the man who had just saved her life was now fighting for his own. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and shouted medical jargon, Brooke fading in and out of consciousness, asking over and over where Ridge was, refusing to be sedated until someone promised her he was alive, while in another ambulance Ridge flatlined briefly, his heart stuttering before a shock brought him back, his body jolting violently as the paramedic yelled for him to stay with them, to keep fighting. By the time they arrived at the hospital, word had already spread, and the Forrester and Logan families converged in the waiting room, faces pale, voices hushed, Steffi pacing like a caged animal, Thomas staring blankly at the floor, Taylor clutching her chest as Brooke was rushed past them, alive but fragile, while Ridge was taken straight into emergency surgery. Hours crawled by, the kind of hours that feel endless, filled with whispered prayers and memories replayed on a loop, Brooke lying in a hospital bed, oxygen hissing softly, staring at the ceiling as guilt crushed her because she knew, that Ridge had pushed himself too far for her, that he had chosen her life over his own without a second thought. And when the doctor finally emerged, removing his mask, the room fell silent, every breath held, and the words he spoke would echo forever. Ridge had suffered a massive cardiac event triggered by smoke inhalation and extreme physical stress. They'd done everything they could, but there had been complications, and now all they could do was wait. Brooke broke then, sobbing uncontrollably, begging to see him, to tell him she was sorry, to tell him she loved him, and when they finally allowed her into the ICU, she stood at his bedside, trembling, looking at the man who had been her anchor through so much chaos, now motionless, machines breathing for him, tubes and wires everywhere, and she whispered through tears that she would trade places with him if she could, that she never asked him to be her hero, that she just needed him to wake. Steffi watched from the doorway, her heart torn in two, anger and gratitude warring inside her, because Ridge was her father, her rock, and he had almost died saving the woman who had broken their family so many times, and yet she couldn't deny the truth. He had done it out of pure love without hesitation, and that kind of sacrifice changed everything. Days passed, each one heavier than the last, Ridge slipping in and out of consciousness, sometimes squeezing Brooke's hand, sometimes not responding at all, and every small improvement felt like a victory, every setback like a cruel blow, until finally, one quiet morning, the doctor delivered news no one was prepared for. Ridge's heart had been severely weakened, and while he was alive, his life would never be the same, the risk too great for him to continue living the way he always had, pushing himself, carrying everyone else's burdens, and Brooke understood then that the sacrifice wasn't just in that moment on the concrete floor. It was ongoing, permanent. When Ridge finally woke fully, his voice hoarse, his eyes searching until they found Brooke, he smiled faintly and whispered that he'd do it again, that saving her was worth everything, and Brooke collapsed against his chest, careful of the monitors, crying not from fear this time but from the overwhelming realization that love had cost them both more than they ever imagined. Outside that hospital room, the family dynamics shifted, old grudges softened, new truths emerged, because everyone had seen what Ridge was willing to give, had seen the finality of his choice, and the words final sacrifice hung heavy in the air. Not because he had died, but because a part of the man they knew had been forever changed. The fire at Forrester Creations would be investigated, blamed on faulty wiring, written off as a tragic accident, but for those who lived through it, for Brooke who owed her life to Ridge's strength, and for Ridge who had stared death in the face to save the woman he loved, it would always be remembered as the day everything stopped, the day love burned brighter than fear, and the day a desperate cry, "Help! He's not breathing," marked the moment when sacrifice became destiny in the world of the bold and the beautiful. And yet, even after the machine steadied and the doctor spoke in cautious tones about recovery and limits and a future forever altered, the true aftermath of that day did not reveal itself all at once. It unfolded slowly, painfully, in the quiet moments that followed, when the adrenaline was gone and the reality of what almost happened settled into every corner of their lives. Brooke remained at Ridge's bedside as much as the nurses would allow, sleeping upright in an uncomfortable chair, waking at every change in his breathing, every shift of a monitor, her hand never straying far from his, as if letting go for even a second might tempt fate to take him back. In those long sleepless nights, memories replayed in her mind like scenes from another lifetime. Every argument, every breakup, every reconciliation, every moment she'd taken his presence for granted, and each memory carried the same brutal question. What if this had been the last chapter? What if his sacrifice had truly been final? The weight of that possibility pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe even now, safe within sterile white hospital walls. Ridge, when he was conscious, drifted in and out of lucidity, his thoughts fractured, his body exhausted in a way he'd never experienced before. He dreamed of fire and smoke, of Brooke's face fading in and out of view, of reaching for her and feeling his strength slip away. Sometimes he woke with a start, gasping, his heart racing until a nurse rushed in to calm him, to remind him where he was, to remind him he was alive. And every time, without fail, his first word was Brooke's name. It became something the nurses whispered about among themselves, the way he searched for her even before he searched for air, the way his pulse steadied the moment she spoke to him, the way his hand tightened weakly around hers as if that connection alone anchored him to this world. Outside the ICU, the family struggled to navigate a reality none of them had prepared for. Steffi tried to be strong, tried to be the pillar everyone expected her to be, but the sight of her father lying helpless in that bed haunted her. She replayed the moment she'd been told he collapsed, the terror that had sliced through her chest, the realization that for all his strength and stubbornness, Ridge Forrester was not invincible. And layered over that fear was something else. Conflicted, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. Brooke had survived because of him. Brooke was alive because her father chose her without hesitation. Steffi didn't know how to reconcile that with years of resentment and unresolved anger, and some nights she sat alone in her car in the hospital parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, tears sliding down her face as she whispered that she wasn't ready to lose him. Not now, not ever. Thomas, too, was changed by what he witnessed. He had always seen Ridge as unshakable, the man who could weather any storm, but seeing his father brought to the brink of death stripped away that illusion. Guilt gnawed at him. Guilt for past conflicts, for words left unsaid, for time wasted on grudges that now felt meaningless. Standing outside the ICU one evening, he watched Brooke rest her head gently against Ridge's shoulder, careful not to disturb the tubes, and instead of anger he felt something unexpected: gratitude. Whatever his feelings about Brooke, he couldn't deny the truth. His father loved her deeply, and that love had nearly cost him his life. It was impossible to witness that and remain unchanged. Taylor returned to Los Angeles the moment she heard, her heart breaking as she rushed to the hospital, memories of her own history with Ridge colliding painfully with the present. Seeing Brooke by his side stirred complicated emotions, jealousy, sadness, understanding, all tangled together in a way only decades of shared history could create. But when Taylor stood at Ridge's bedside, watching his chest rise and fall with mechanical assistance, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that the man they both loved in different ways was still here. She told Brooke quietly, sincerely, that Ridge's children needed her to stay strong, that Ridge needed her, and in that moment, an unspoken truce settled between them, forged not by forgiveness, but by shared fear and hope. As days turned into weeks, Ridge's condition stabilized enough for doctors to discuss the next steps, and those conversations were sobering. The damage to his heart was significant. Smoke inhalation had compromised his lungs. Stress, years of it, had taken a toll no one could ignore anymore. He would survive, they said, but survival came with conditions. No more pushing himself to the edge. No more living as if sheer willpower could override biology. His lifestyle, his work, his role as the unyielding backbone of Forrester Creations, all of it would have to change. Brooke listened to every word, her heart sinking with each clinical explanation, because she knew Ridge. She knew how deeply his identity was tied to being strong, being needed, being the one who carried everyone else. Asking him to let go of that would be its own kind of heartbreak. When Ridge was finally moved out of the ICU, the room felt brighter, the air lighter, but the sense of danger hadn't fully lifted. He was weaker, thinner, his movements slow and deliberate, frustration flickering in his eyes every time he struggled to sit up or walk a few steps with assistance. Brooke stayed close, offering quiet encouragement, but she could see the battle raging inside him, the fear of becoming a burden, the anger at his own body for betraying him, the unspoken terror that this was the beginning of the end of the life he knew. One afternoon, when the room was quiet and the sunlight filtered softly through the blinds, he finally voiced what he'd been holding back. He told Brooke he didn't know who he was if he couldn't protect her, couldn't provide, couldn't be the man he'd always been. His voice cracked as he admitted that collapsing on that floor, gasping for breath, had been the most helpless moment of his life. Brooke listened, tears welling in her eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was steady in a way that surprised even her. She told him that he didn't save her because he was strong. He saved her because he loved her. That it wasn't his physical power that mattered, but his heart, flawed and exhausted as it might be. She reminded him that he didn't owe anyone heroics anymore, that his worth wasn't measured by sacrifice or suffering. And for the first time since the fire, Ridge allowed himself to cry, silent tears sliding down his cheeks as he squeezed her hand, the release long overdue. Word of Ridge's condition spread quickly, and Forrester Creations felt his absence immediately. Meetings were postponed. Decisions were delayed. The building itself seemed quieter, subdued, as if the walls remembered the smoke and chaos. Eric struggled with the reality that his son might never return to the role he'd always played, the weight of legacy pressing heavily on him. Steffi stepped up more than ever, her determination sharpened by fear, by love, by the knowledge that the future of the company, and the family, might soon rest on her shoulders. But even as she took charge, she found herself glancing at Ridge's empty office, a lump forming in her throat at the thought that things might never be the same again. When Ridge was finally discharged, the moment was bittersweet. There was relief, celebration, cautious optimism, but also undeniable uncertainty. He returned home not as the indestructible patriarch, but as a man who moved carefully, who tired easily, who had to be reminded to rest. Brooke transformed their home into a sanctuary of calm, adjusting her life entirely around his recovery, refusing to let him feel like a burden, even when exhaustion crept into her bones. Late at night when Ridge slept, she sometimes slipped into the bathroom and cried quietly, overwhelmed by gratitude that he was alive and terror at how close she'd come to losing him. The emotional fallout rippled outward, touching everyone in their orbit. Old rivalries softened. Long-standing grudges lost their edge. People who had taken sides for years found themselves questioning what any of it was worth in the face of mortality. Even Bill Spencer, rarely shaken, stood silently in the hospital hallway one day, staring at Ridge's room, the gravity of what happened sinking in. He and Ridge had been enemies, allies, everything in between, but seeing him so vulnerable forced Bill to confront an uncomfortable truth. None of them were untouchable, no matter how powerful they thought they were. As weeks passed, Ridge grew stronger, but the doctor's warnings loomed over every step forward. The fire had taken something from him that would never fully return. And yet, in that loss, something else emerged: clarity. Ridge began to see his life through a different lens, questioning priorities he'd never had time to examine before. He spent more time with his children, listened more, argued less. He laughed softly instead of booming. He held Brooke's hand like it was something fragile, precious beyond measure. And Brooke, in turn, learned to accept love without fear, without waiting for the next disaster to tear it away. Still, the memory of that desperate cry, "Help! He's not breathing," never fully faded. It echoed in Brooke's mind whenever Ridge pushed himself too hard, whenever he brushed off a symptom, whenever he insisted he was fine. It echoed in Steffi's heart whenever she looked at her father and saw not just the man who raised her, but the man who almost didn't make it home. It echoed through Forrester Creations, a reminder etched into the building's history, a line drawn between before and after. In the end, Ridge's sacrifice wasn't defined by death, but by transformation. He didn't give his life, but he gave up the illusion of invincibility, the relentless drive that had fueled him for decades. He gave his family a chance to see him not as a hero carved from stone, but as a man made of flesh and blood, capable of fear, weakness, and profound love. And Brooke, saved by that love, carried the weight of it with humility and devotion, knowing that every day they shared now was a gift forged in fire, smoke, and a moment when the world stopped, breath held, as destiny hovered on the edge, and chose just barely to let them go on.